check how many times I've been arrested in the last 8 years. But no reason. Try to kill me, because all the just tried to kill me. They was all trying to kill me, nigga. I was shooting at everything.
I said, no one's gonna help me. I'm gonna have to take care of this myself. And I still feel guilty about this part. And I pray to God my son never sees this. But I was gonna shoot him in the back of the head. I had in my mind, this is the only way to stop him. I was gonna take him out to the woods, and I was just gonna put one in his head and leave. And I was going to be okay with going to jail. I knew it was wrong, but I had to do it.
Cleveland Heights police officer Jason West was shot and killed while responding to a street fight.
Police say the shooter is 27-year-old Timothy Halton.
These officers shot. Oh my God. There's a ambulance down here now. It's down, man. The officer shot the innocent ambulance. We got one on the way.
Oh, it's chilly. Must. Oh my goodness. Can I have a minute? Please. Oh, wait. Oh my God, why? That's what I tried to prevent. Timmy was my big, sweet teddy bear that morphed into a monster. I love my son dearly, but if I would have killed him, Jason West would still be alive. I don't know how bad this is gonna sound, but if it were Timmy that was killed, I would have preferred that. You did what I thought you were going to do, and I couldn't stop it. And it's hard. It's hard to wrap your head around it because he's still my baby. He's still my baby. And now he's a murderer. As a parent, you always blame yourself. You always question, did I do enough? What could I have done different? I mean, he was just so adorable. And those cheeks that he had, you know, growing up, the cheeks, everybody would just squeeze. And I have a lot of happy memories. I just have a lot of sad ones, too. I had no desire to have children. None whatsoever. It was not in my plans. I just wanted to go to school. I didn't tell anybody at first that I was pregnant. My mom wanted to know by whom, and I told her, the organist at the church. And so I had to get married to save the church embarrassment, to save me embarrassment. It was nothing to be happy about. The way I looked at my unborn child is, how am I gonna love this baby when I don't want kids? I'm a kid myself. But then they put that baby on my chest, and it just, I felt the joy of motherhood then. I did. I just instantly loved him. And I told him, I want to protect you with everything I can. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're my baby. 16, my little baby. I felt this love and I had never felt before. And I was so happy with this part of my life. I devoted all my time to him. Married at 16, 2 kids by 17, divorced at 18. I didn't know how to do this thing. I didn't know how to raise children. They were being raised along with me. I just knew I had to love them. I knew I had to protect them. I go upstairs, and check on them, and he's not in the bed. I was scared. I was like, what happened? I ran all over the house looking for him. I ran everywhere, checking the bathrooms. I had never been so scared in my life because I'm thinking the worst. And then, I don't know, an inner voice said, look in the closet. And I looked, and I see my clothes are pulled down. And then I see his hand sticking out. He was all curled up but the clothes, he had pulled my clothes down to make a blanket. So he was covered up. And I felt such a relief. I wake him up, make sure he's okay. And I'm trying to talk to him, and it's like he's looking past me. I'm like, what is wrong with him? I don't know how to explain it, but I had the weirdest feeling. Eventually, it just became an every night thing. I would see him walking down the hallway, and I would follow him, and I would talk to him. He wouldn't say anything. And his face, it was just a blank stare. Just a blank stare. And it made me question, is there a demon in there? I know there's God, I know there's the devil as well. I was terrified. One day, I smelled something really foul, and I'm looking around. Finally, I check under the bed, and it's just a shoe box, and the smell is stronger. And I open up the shoebox, and there's a bird inside, dead, cut open. Oh, it disgusted me. That disgusted me. It really freaked me out because it's like, why is there a dead bird in a box with a knife under my son's bed? What is he doing? And so finally I called him in and I asked him, what is this? And he didn't answer me at first. And I said, Timmy, this bird is dead and cut open. I said, did you do this? And he said, yes, I did it. I was just putting it out of its misery. I just did not want to think that my son could be cruel. I was totally freaked out because this is not normal. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal. It kept happening. It kept happening. So, of course, I'm like, oh, this is bigger than I thought. And I did not have a clue of what to do, and I was frightened. I just knew something was wrong with my son. Because I had heard that, like, psychopaths, they start off by killing animals. I never asked if he regretted it or felt bad. I was really scared to talk about it with him. I was afraid. I didn't want to hear what the answer was really going to be. But I didn't want to him to say, oh, I have fun doing this. I like the blood squirting out. I didn't know what was going to be said, so I just didn't ask. I knew something was wrong with my son, but I didn't know what. And it was like, well, maybe it is a demon. I made every excuse up you can. That's what parents do. That's what mothers, especially, that's what we do. We will make up an excuse and stick with it. We love our babies so much, and we want the best for them. We don't want to think the worst, but I didn't know what was coming next.
Halton is accused of shooting and killing Cleveland Heights police officer Jason West. Officer West never pulled a gun on Halton. He did not have the chance. Halton shot Officer West as he arrived on scene.
I do still cry about it because it wasn't the life I had planned for my child. I mean, no one wants their child to be a killer. It was kind of shocking to the system and something I'll never get over. You see the light we're approaching is right after the next light. There's a sign in memory of investigator Jason D. West. I drive past it going to work and coming from work. Because he lived in one of these houses here. You know, that sign may not mean anything to a lot of people, and it means a lot. That sign is there because my son killed him. I say a quick prayer and drive right past it. My babies. Oh my God. So adorable. Him in his little suit, her in a little dress. I used to love dressing them up. He was such a happy kid. So happy, so polite, so loving. He and his sister were so close. I mean, she loved her brother. They were best friends. They were. But then he changed. I'm getting her ready for her bath, and she has a bunch of marks on her thighs. I asked her, what is this? Did you get bitten by something? And she's just like, no. And she tried to cover up real quick. And after a long pause, she said, Timmy made this shocking toy, and he shocks me. I'm like, what do you mean shock you? He burns me. And he told me if I tell you, he was gonna get me. He had tied her to the chair, and I don't know how he did it, but he would take wires out of a radio and he would shock her. It became real in that moment because now you're hurting your sister, physically abusing her. I didn't want to whoop my children, but there was no stopping me. You're getting whooped. Even whooping him. He had no emotion. He had no emotion. You spank him, and it's not one of those things where I want to keep spanking you harder just to make you break. But no, he was very emotionless. After I whooped him, I just went in my room and cried. It was really hard for me to handle that I gave birth to someone that could be so cruel as to do this, and I just couldn't understand it. It's not exactly what I was dreaming of as a parent. couple weeks later, I come home early from work, and she's in a chair. I said, is he shocking you? Is he doing it again? And she said, yeah, mommy, yeah, mommy. And then Chrissy told me, as he was shocking her, the louder she yelled or screeched, the more he laughed about it. It was a range of emotions, from fear to hurt that she's going through this to anger. So I tried to talk to him, but I was trying to get down to the bottom of it. Why do you like hurting things? Why? Why do you like inflicting pain? What kind of joy are you getting here? And he would just look at me. I don't know why. I don't know why. I would never get an answer. I was like, this is not normal. What is wrong with my son? I was terrified because no parent, first of all, wants their child to be bad, but to be violent, and for no reason other than the reason that's in his head. There was a time where the family could say, oh, we have to pray it away. We have to pray it away. We've got to pray that demon away. You know, but they wanted to do literally an exorcism, you know, in the church. I know there's a God, and I believe there's hell also. There was something evil inside of him. My baby. Okay. Hello?
Hello, this is a free call from an inmate at the Allen Correctional Institution.
Hey, baby.
Hey, Ma, how you doing?
I'm doing good. What's up?
Not much. I miss you.
I miss you too. I miss you too. I have to get your food box for you. I haven't forgotten.
Oh, okay. I love you.
I love you too. I miss my hugs.
Yeah, I need you one right now.
You give me one right now? Okay, thank you. Yeah, what you been up to?
I ain't been up to nothing. How you been?
I've been okay. Just, I've been good. Just doing little projects, you know, around the house and everything.
Oh, okay.
All right, baby. I'm gonna get back to work now, okay?
All right, I love you.
I love you too. Bye-bye. Talk to you soon.
Go ahead and sleep. So he knows.
All right, this is take two. ABC Mark.
He knows what you're doing, right?
No.
He doesn't know what you're doing. So you're gonna tell him now? You're not telling him that you're doing this interview. Why?
Well, my son is very sensitive, and I know for a fact he's ashamed and embarrassed of the things he did. I know it hurts him, and this will hurt him.
So once again, you're a mother protecting him.
I have to. I have to protect my baby. He's gonna be 45 on March 30th. He's still my baby, though. You never stop loving them. You do a lot of forgiving and hope they forgive you for the things, you know, as a parent that you might have done wrong or that they didn't agree with. But no, you never stop loving them. It just breaks my heart that he's in there and he's never coming home. I received a call at work. It was the principal of the school, and they requested that I come up immediately. And I was like, well, what's wrong? What's going on? We'll talk to you when you get here. By the time I got there, he's sitting in a straitjacket in a chair that's locked down to the floor. I just saw a little baby in a straitjacket. Are you serious? But I'm scared because I'm like, what did he do? So apparently, one of the teachers asked him about his father, which was a sore subject with him. And he just tackled her. So security got him off her. He's kicking, screaming, throwing things, tearing up the desk and everything. And they ended up putting him in a straitjacket. Mind you, it's a school for children with behavioral issues, so they're used to seeing things. But they said this was extreme. My son was violent. Oh, this one, I think he's about 15 on this picture. And all of a sudden, he was happier. He had finished all his high school courses, and the teacher submitted an application for college, and he was accepted. Timmy said, "Don't tell my mom, I want to tell her." So he came home and told me. He was so excited. And he was on cloud nine. He was on cloud nine. He said, "Finally, I did something right." I was so proud of him. And he was so happy that I was proud of him because he had caused me so much heartache and pain. It gave me so much hope. It was like, finally. It was the time where I was like, okay, he's getting it together. He started getting violent, and with each episode, the violence was worse than the last time. And it just kept escalating and escalating. Well, you're really trying to make me cry, aren't you? A slow, violent descent. Okay. They have here his run-ins with the law. Bare-chested Timothy Halton Jr. punches and kicks a 60-year-old man who walks past his home. The man is hit on the side of the head, his jaw, and side. Halton yells at the bloodied man to get out of here. At this time, he's 20 years old, and they would hang out at the mall, and he just started punching people in the head for no reason. This was an incident just the next day, July 9th, 2000. Police get a call from Halton's screaming sister who has locked her brother out of the house. Disorderly conduct charge is later dismissed. That was part of the problem. No matter what he did, no matter who he hurt, they dismissed him. He just got one slap on the wrist after another. And so I'm sitting there. They bring him in, and he's in a straitjacket. And I thought, what did he do to get back in the straitjacket? They told me he had been attacking the nurses. And I'm trying to act like, okay, this is normal. Okay, I'm just happy to see him. They kept it at a short visit. It was time to go. And they said I had to leave first. So I started walking away, and all of a sudden I hear all this commotion. And Timmy's straitjacketing and all, is knocking people out. He was just like using his shoulders and his head and kicking and literally attacking everyone. And I asked the doctor, he just said, "We suspect your child has schizophrenia." We're not 100% sure, but we believe he might be suffering from schizophrenia. But I will never forget that face and the way he looked back. It was not my son. I swear to God, and it's so hard to make anyone believe, but I was looking at a devil. I look at pictures of Timmy all the time, especially when he was younger. I love looking at his baby pictures because he was so fat and chubby and adorable, of course. Mothers, we don't think our kids ever grow up. We still keep them as a baby. I'm still thinking, this is my sweet Timmy. My son was morphing into something I did not recognize. It just wasn't Timmy, it's two people there. He was always sweet. He was always polite. He was always kind. He would morph into a whole different being. I mean, the way he walked, the way he talked, the way he looked at you. It was scary. You are always on edge because you know something's gonna happen. You can never let your guard down. At this time, there were many episodes. He would walk around the house just screaming. It was an awful, awful, awful sound. It was so scary. He punched holes throughout my entire house. My daughter was terrified of him at this time, and she had the new baby. And at this point, she was scared to sleep alone. So her and the baby would sleep with me. So that's when we started going to the bathroom together. Me, her, and the baby. We'd get in that bathroom. It was nice that we slept in that bathroom. Because each episode was worse than the last. My daughter couldn't stand living with him out of fear. She's like, Mommy, he's gonna get us if we kick him out. This situation was so hopeless. I was like, my daughter can't live like this. I have a granddaughter now. She's not gonna go through what my daughter went through. And I bought a gun because I needed to protect my daughter. It was gonna be Timmy or Chrissy. I just rushed home, and when I got there, I see blood on the wall. And I got my gun out my purse, and I was listening at the same time as I was walking up the steps. I didn't know if he was still in the house. I just knew there was blood on my wall. And so I go to the bedroom, and I'm at the door. And I don't want to twist this doorknob, but I know I have to, because I didn't know what I was going to see behind that door. So my hand was on the door for like seeing before eternity. Then I just twisted and opened it. I didn't see anything. And I'm like, Chrissy. She's like, Mommy, I'm in here. I'm in the cubby hole. We made a cubby hole. And so I slid the fake wall away. And she's like, I don't know where Timmy is, Mommy. I don't know. He was howling. And he was acting strange. He kept saying he was coming after me. And so I had me and the baby hid in here. At that time, she had already called 911. When the police got there, they searched the house, they searched around the house, they couldn't find Timmy, but they found a cut-up cat. And that's where the blood came from. I was beyond words. It's not getting better, it's worse. And you have no conscience about it. That scared me in itself. It got to the point where I was so powerless. I felt like I am losing my mind. And I said, no one's going to help me. I'm going to have to take care of this myself. Told him, come on, let's go for a ride. And we're driving and we're talking and everything. And my plan was to just go sit. It's a park called Forest Hills. And we were just going to go sit there as we did often. And I was going to, Timmy, look over there. Look over there. I couldn't face him and do it. Not that it made it any better. I was going to shoot him in the back of the head. This isn't something I wanted to do. This is something I felt I had to do. I kept picturing my daughter and picturing my daughter. But I literally had it pointed at him, and I was a good shot. My hands were trembling, and I just dropped it. Fell to my knees. And I remember letting out this horrible scream. I mean, it just came out of me. And he runs back, and he's like, Mommy, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? He didn't understand why I was crying. I never told him. But at that point, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Even in the best circumstances, parents always question, did I do the right thing? Did I make a mistake by doing this? Why couldn't you stop him? You don't know what you're going to do until you're in that position, until you have to address something. And at times you still don't know what you're going to do, but you try to make the best decision. It seemed like no matter what I did, I was wrong. It's not getting better, it's worse. I could have stopped it. If I would have killed him, then Jason West would still be alive. That's when the judge put him on probation, a 4-year probation, where he had to stay medicated, monitored, stay off drugs, alcohol, see his psychiatrist, social worker, counselor, whoever, take a drug test. And if he didn't do that, he was going to jail. That would be a violation of his probation, and he would go straight to jail. Yeah, that was a miracle. And I noticed the big difference. He worked 6 days a week. He was so proud of himself. He bought a brand new car. He finally moved out of my house, bought clothes, had a girlfriend, and it just made me feel so good. I was like, finally. After 1 year, he came home. He's like, they took me off probation. And I said, well, what does that mean? So I called the probation officer, and I said, what do you mean he's off probation? He's thriving on probation. He's finally got somewhat of a life. And she said, well, that's why he's doing so good. He doesn't need to be on probation anymore. And I said, well, what about his medication? What about his shots? Oh, that ends too. I was like, are you serious? Don't you have his records. If you don't get his records. I said, look it over, reconsider, please. Reconsider. You're gonna keep letting my son go until he kills somebody. And that's exactly what's gonna happen. He's gonna kill somebody. His childhood friend called me, I think it was around 8:30, that Saturday morning. And he's like, Timmy shot a cop last night. Timmy shot. I'm like, what? Timmy shot a cop. We don't know where he is. We don't know where he is. He ran off. We don't know him. And I let out this scream. The news said that he was still at large. And so I called Cleveland Heights Police, and I told them who he was. You know, I said, that's my son, Timothy Halton. I called the police station to turn my son in because it's murder. I mean, he killed someone, and it may not have stopped there. And there was no way I could deny that at that point, I'm the mother of a cop killer, and my son killed someone. I just started crying on the phone, and I said, "Sir, I'm sorry for your loss." And he said, "I'm sorry for yours, too." It was chilling. I could still feel the chills now. It was very chilling, and that was it. He just hung up. "I'm sorry for yours, too."
Y'all said that I tried to kill a cop who just tried to run into my truck, pulled me in the driveway, blocked me off, jumped out, and pulled his gun on me. All crazy for no reason.
Halton at times saying he didn't do anything, other times saying he acted in self-defense, then admitting his crime.
I let all three in the motherfucking face. Is that what you want to hear? Hell yeah.
Wow.
What do you see when you look at that picture?
How am I looking at this picture of this grown man, and I just see my baby. Still see my little baby in his eyes. A lost life. I know people are gonna hate me when I say this, but I see a victim as well. I do, and I don't care who gets mad, but he shouldn't have had to have begged and pleaded and ran all around the city to try to get a shot to prevent him from hurting people. How is that acceptable in society? After the incident, I was fearful of retaliation from my whole family. I mean, he's behind bars and we're still out here. And I would be so ashamed. I would walk with my head down, hoping they didn't recognize me because my face was plastered everywhere, you know, and I couldn't sleep at night. I was terrified. I was scared for him as well. He's the monster. I'm the monster's mother. It's an awful feeling. It's something that you never get over, you know, for the family, for Jason's family. You know, I remember his birthday, February 10th. I grieved for his mother on Mother's Day. His sister, he had one sister just like my daughter. I feel for them because there's nothing I can say or do to bring Jason back. It's just an awful feeling. It's not a day that goes by that I don't think about it, them, what happened, my son, and his situation. I'll always question what was in his mind because I've never gotten a clear answer. Is my son evil or is he mentally ill? And can you explain the difference? No one wants their child to murder anyone. You never think of that as part of the possibilities when they grow up and become a teenager, get a girlfriend, get married, have children themselves. As awful as it sounds, I wish that Timmy had died that night instead of Jason. have been a better outcome. It would have been a better outcome for everybody. And I'm not proud to say that, but it's the truth.
November 1989. In the dense forests of New Brunswick, winter was slowly tightening its grip on the land. The trees stood like black silhouettes against a sky that seemed permanently gray. Frost covered abandoned logging roads. Thin sheets of ice formed along the edges of streams, winding through the wilderness. Small rural communities settled into their evening routines earlier than usual. Porch lights flickered on before sunset. Curtains were pulled shut. Doors were checked twice before bedtime. But that year was different. That year, people were afraid. Not the ordinary kind of fear that comes from storms, economic hardship, or the uncertainty of everyday life. This was a different fear. A fear with a face. A fear with a name. Alan Legere. By the fall of 1989, nearly everyone in the Miramichi region knew that name. Children heard adults whisper it at kitchen tables. Shop owners discussed it behind cash registers. Farmers talked about it while fueling their trucks before dawn. Church congregations spoke about it after Sunday services. Everywhere, the same question echoed through the communities scattered across northeastern New Brunswick. Where is he now? No one knew. That uncertainty was perhaps the most terrifying part, because Alan Legere wasn't sitting behind prison walls. He wasn't awaiting trial. He wasn't being transported between secure facilities. He was out there, somewhere, hidden among thousands of square kilometers of forests, rivers, abandoned cabins, and rural back roads. And people knew exactly what he was capable of. The murders had transformed him into something larger than a criminal. To many residents, he had become a nightmare walking in human form. A predator who appeared without warning and vanished before anyone could stop him. A ghost moving through the darkness. A real-life monster. On the night of November 23rd, 1989, fear once again swept through the region. Police vehicles raced through the cold darkness. Roadblocks appeared along highways. Officers carrying flashlights searched wooded areas. Helicopters cut through the night sky. Something was happening. Rumors spread quickly. Had he struck again? Had someone seen him? Was he finally cornered? Inside homes throughout Miramichi, families gathered around televisions and radios waiting for updates. Many had been living this way for months. Every strange sound outside triggered anxiety. Every barking dog caused concern. Every unexpected knock on the door sent a wave of panic through households already exhausted by fear. Some parents no longer allowed their children to walk alone. Others kept hunting rifles close at hand during the night. Many residents slept with lights on. Some barely slept at all. For nearly 7 months, the region had existed under a shadow, and nobody knew when that shadow would disappear. Yet the story did not begin in 1989. It began years earlier, long before helicopters filled the skies, long before police checkpoints blocked rural roads, long before terrified citizens locked themselves inside their homes. The story began with a violent man whose anger seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. A man who spent years drifting through crime after crime. A man whose name rarely attracted national attention until it was too late. Alan Joseph Legere. People who encountered him often described an unsettling presence. He was not physically imposing in the way movie villains are often portrayed. There was nothing cinematic about him, nothing that immediately screamed danger. Yet beneath the ordinary exterior existed something deeply disturbing. A volatility that could ignite without warning. A capacity for violence that seemed almost limitless. Years before the murders that would make him infamous, he had already built a criminal record filled with thefts, assaults, and armed robberies. Each offense appeared to be another step down a dark path. Each arrest another warning. Each conviction another indication that the danger was growing. But even then, few could have imagined what was coming. Few could have predicted that one day entire communities would barricade themselves inside their homes because of him. Few could have imagined that elderly women, sisters, and respected community members would become victims in one of the most terrifying crime sprees in Canadian history. And nobody could have predicted that this case would ultimately help change criminal investigations forever through a revolutionary scientific tool that was still new to the world. DNA. At the time, Those 3 letters meant almost nothing to most Canadians. Within a few years, they would become synonymous with one of the most important breakthroughs in modern criminal justice. But before science could catch up with the killer, innocent people would pay a devastating price. Lives would be shattered. Families would be destroyed. Entire communities would learn what it feels like to live in constant fear. Because fear spreads in ways violence alone cannot. Violence claims individual victims. Fear infects everyone. It slips beneath locked doors. It settles into empty streets. It follows people into bed at night. It turns familiar places into threatening ones. And during those months in 1989, fear belonged to Miramichi. The region's vast forests suddenly felt different. Roads that had once seemed peaceful became unsettling. Every isolated farmhouse looked vulnerable. Every elderly resident living alone became a potential target. Nobody knew who might be next. Nobody knew where the killer would appear. And perhaps most frightening of all, nobody knew whether the police could stop him before he struck again. As autumn deepened and winter approached, the search intensified. Hundreds of officers worked around the clock. Tips flooded in. Witnesses reported sightings. Search teams combed through forests. Dogs tracked scents through frozen terrain. Yet somehow, Alan Legere kept disappearing. Again and again. Like smoke slipping through someone's fingers. Like a shadow retreating into darkness. The newspapers followed every development. Radio stations interrupted programming with updates. Television reporters stood beside police command centers, delivering the latest information. The story consumed the province, then the country, and eventually much of the world, because this was no longer simply a manhunt. It was a battle between a community desperate for safety and a fugitive who seemed determined to spread terror wherever he went. Months earlier, people had worried about everyday concerns. Bills, work, family problems, the weather. Now survival had become the priority. Trust had been replaced by suspicion. Comfort had been replaced by vigilance. Normal life had been replaced by fear. Yet somewhere within that fear, another story was unfolding. A story about courage. About grieving families refusing to let victims become forgotten headlines. About investigators working through exhaustion. About communities refusing to surrender despite months of terror. And ultimately, a story about justice. Because every manhunt ends one of 2 ways. Either the hunter finds the prey, or the prey finds another victim. In the freezing darkness of late 1989, nobody yet knew which ending awaited New Brunswick. All they knew was that somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the frozen roads and silent farmhouses, a killer was still free. And before this nightmare was over, Canada would witness one of the most significant criminal investigations in its history. An investigation born from bloodshed, driven by fear, and destined to change forensic science forever. To understand how an entire region of Canada came to fear the name Alan Legere, it is necessary to travel back long before the manhunt, before the murders that dominated headlines, and before police helicopters circled above the forests of New Brunswick. The story begins in a province defined by rugged landscapes and tightly connected communities. New Brunswick is a place where rivers carve through dense forests, where small towns are separated by long stretches of winding roads, and where people often know their neighbors for decades. In communities like Miramichi, Black River Bridge, Chatham, and Newcastle, life moved at a slower pace than in Canada's larger cities. Families attended the same churches for generations. Local businesses served customers they had known their entire lives. Doors were often left unlocked. Children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods without their parents worrying about what might happen after sunset. There was a deep sense of familiarity in these communities, a belief that while crime existed elsewhere, serious violence was something that happened far away. It was a belief shared by many rural Canadians during the 1970s and early 1980s. Yet beneath the surface of this peaceful setting, another story was developing. Alan Joseph Legere was born in 1948 in New Brunswick. His early years did not immediately predict the terror he would later unleash. To most people, he appeared to be just another young man growing up in a working-class environment. But as he entered adulthood, troubling patterns began to emerge. Encounters with the law became increasingly common. Petty crimes gradually escalated into more serious offenses. Theft led to violence. Violence led to armed robbery. Those who crossed paths with him often described someone who seemed quick to anger and difficult to predict. There was an instability in his behavior that unsettled people. Arguments could escalate rapidly. Threats were not uncommon. Behind the ordinary appearance was a man whose relationship with violence seemed to grow stronger over time. Criminal records can sometimes read like dry collections of dates and charges, but behind each entry lies a choice. In Leger's case, those choices repeatedly moved in the same direction. Instead of stepping away from crime, he appeared to move deeper into it. Law enforcement officers who dealt with him saw a pattern that suggested escalating danger. Each arrest was another warning sign. Each conviction, another indication that his capacity for violence was expanding. Yet even then, few imagined he would eventually become one of the most feared criminals in Canadian history. By the mid-1980s, New Brunswick remained largely insulated from the type of serial violence that had shocked other regions of North America. People worried about economic challenges, harsh winters, and everyday concerns. The idea that a future serial killer was already living among them seemed unimaginable. Then came the night that changed everything for one family. On June 21st, 1986, John and Mary Glendenning were inside their store in Black River Bridge. They were well known in the community. Their business was more than a store. It was a gathering place where neighbors stopped to chat, exchange news, and maintain the social connections that held the community together. John and Mary represented the kind of hardworking local residents found throughout rural Canada. They had built their lives through dedication and perseverance. That summer evening began like countless others. Nothing suggested that within hours their lives would be shattered. During the night, Alan Leger and an accomplice entered the property. What followed was an act of violence so brutal that it would leave lasting scars on the community. John Glendenning was attacked with extraordinary force. The assault was savage. The level of violence went far beyond what would be necessary during a robbery. It reflected something darker, something deeply disturbing about the attacker's mindset. John died from his injuries. Mary suffered a horrifying attack of her own. Despite severe injuries, she managed to survive. In unimaginable pain, she crawled through the house searching for help. Every movement required enormous effort. Every second mattered. Eventually, she reached a telephone and called for assistance. That call transformed her from victim to survivor. Her determination ensured that investigators would have crucial evidence. The attack shocked New Brunswick. Rural communities are often deeply affected by violent crimes because the victims are rarely strangers. They are neighbors, friends, customers, and familiar faces. The murder of John Glendenning was not simply another crime statistic. It was a wound felt throughout the region. Investigators quickly focused on Alan Leger. Evidence connected him to the crime, and eventually he was arrested and convicted. He received a life sentence. For many residents, that conviction brought relief. Dangerous men occasionally emerge in every society, but prison walls create a sense of separation. They create the belief that the threat has been removed. Families return to their routines. Communities began to heal. The name Alan Leger slowly faded from daily conversation. Most people assumed they would never hear it again. But prisons are not always the end of a story. Sometimes they are merely an intermission. While serving his sentence, Leger spent years behind bars. On paper, the threat appeared contained. Yet beneath that appearance, circumstances were developing that would eventually lead to disaster. Correctional facilities face constant challenges. Medical appointments must be arranged. Inmates require treatment. Security procedures must balance safety with practical realities. It was within that system that a critical opportunity emerged. In May 1989, Leger was transported from prison to a hospital for treatment related to an ear infection. Such transfers occurred regularly and were considered routine. No one involved could fully appreciate the consequences that would follow. The hospital environment was fundamentally different from a prison. Security existed, but it lacked the layers of protection found inside correctional institutions. Leger recognized that difference. Somewhere along the way, he had obtained a piece of sharpened metal, small enough to conceal, dangerous enough to become a tool for escape. What happened next would become one of the most notorious prison escapes in Canadian history. Using the hidden metal object, Leger freed himself from restraints. He overpowered those responsible for guarding him and escaped. Within moments, Years of imprisonment vanished behind him. Soon afterward, he stole a vehicle and disappeared. News of the escape spread rapidly. Initially, many residents viewed it as alarming but temporary. Escape prisoners are often captured quickly. Police forces mobilize. Roadblocks appear. Tips are collected. Most fugitives make mistakes. Most are found. But Alan Legere was different. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And with each passing day, concern grew. Somewhere within the vast forests and rural communities of New Brunswick, a convicted murderer was free. Summer arrived across the province. Rivers sparkled beneath long daylight hours. Fishing boats moved through familiar waters. Tourists traveled scenic highways. Yet beneath the appearance of normality, anxiety slowly increased. People followed news reports closely. Police searched extensively. Residents remained alert. Still, no one knew exactly where Legere was hiding. Then came the first indications that the nightmare was only beginning. The fear that initially accompanied the escape gradually transformed into something far more serious. Investigators began to suspect that Legere was not merely trying to avoid capture. He was actively hunting for opportunities. Looking back now, historians and criminal investigators often describe this period as the calm before the storm. The province stood on the edge of a crisis without fully realizing it. The escape itself was shocking, but it was what came afterward that would forever change how New Brunswick remembered the name Alan Legere. Rural communities that had once trusted in their safety were about to discover how quickly that sense of security could disappear. Families who had never locked their doors would soon begin checking windows before bed. Elderly residents who had lived alone for decades would become afraid of the darkness outside. Children would hear adults discussing murder at dinner tables. And across the Miramichi region, a simple question would begin to dominate every conversation. Not whether Alan Legere would strike again, but when. Before the headlines, before the police roadblocks, before helicopters swept across the forests of New Brunswick searching for a fugitive killer, there were ordinary people living ordinary lives. That is often the first truth lost in stories like this. When history remembers a serial murder case, it tends to remember the killer. The name of the offender becomes famous. Books are written. Documentaries are produced. Court records are studied. But the people whose lives were stolen deserve more than a brief mention. They deserve to be remembered as they lived. Not as crime scene photographs. Not as evidence exhibits. Not as names buried in legal documents. They were mothers, sisters, neighbors, friends, and community members whose absence left permanent holes in the lives of those who loved them. The first victim in the terrifying series of murders following Alan Legere's escape was 75-year-old Annie Flam. To outsiders, Annie might have appeared to be just another elderly woman living alone in rural New Brunswick. To those who knew her, she was much more. She belonged to a generation that had survived hardships many younger Canadians could barely imagine. She had lived through economic struggles, changing times, and decades of life in a province where resilience was often a necessity rather than a choice. People who knew Annie remembered her as independent. Even in her 70s, she maintained her home and routines. Her life followed a rhythm familiar to many elderly residents of rural Canada. Mornings often began quietly, coffee brewing in the kitchen, the sound of a radio playing softly in the background, sunlight filtering through curtains, the familiar comfort of routine. There is something deeply human about routine. It creates stability. It provides comfort. It makes a house feel like home. For elderly people living alone, those routines often become especially meaningful. Every object has its place. Every activity has its hour. Every day follows a pattern built over decades. Annie's home represented exactly that kind of stability. A place where she felt safe. A place where she expected to spend the coming years surrounded by familiar memories. The thought that danger could enter through her front door would have seemed unimaginable. In communities like hers, trust was part of daily life. Neighbors knew each other. People waved when passing on country roads. Residents often left doors unlocked. Many had spent their entire lives believing that serious violence happened somewhere else. Not here. Not in places where everyone knew everyone. Not in places where families had known each other for generations. But by the summer of 1989, that belief was beginning to crack. News of Alan Legere's escape had spread throughout the province. People talked about it at grocery stores, at church gatherings, at coffee shops, at kitchen tables. The conversations were usually the same. Had anyone seen him? Where might he be hiding? Would police catch him soon? Most people hoped the situation would end quickly. Most wanted to believe authorities would find him before anyone was hurt. Then Annie Flam became proof that those hopes were misplaced. The details of what happened inside her home shocked even experienced investigators. The violence was extreme, far beyond what anyone expected. When officers arrived, they quickly realized this was not a burglary that had gone wrong. This was something darker, something more personal, something driven by rage. The crime sent a wave of fear through New Brunswick. Because Annie represented vulnerability. She was elderly. She lived alone. She posed no threat to anyone. If someone like Annie could become a victim, then who was safe? That question echoed across the region. Families who had never worried about locking their doors suddenly began doing so every night. Some installed extra locks. Others purchased outdoor lights. Neighbors checked on elderly residents more frequently. The murder changed behavior almost immediately. Fear had entered daily life. Yet Annie Flam's story is not defined solely by the violence that ended her life. It is also defined by the life she lived before that night. The years she spent building relationships. The friendships she nurtured. The memories she created. The ordinary moments that make up a human life. Those are the things her loved ones remembered. Not the headlines. Not the crime scene. But the woman herself. Unfortunately, Annie would not be the only victim. As the months passed, Alan Legere continued moving through the region like a shadow. And soon another family would experience unimaginable loss. Donna Donnie and her sister Linda Donnie were known in their community as hardworking, ordinary women. The bond between sisters is often difficult to describe. It is built over decades. Shared childhood memories, shared family gatherings, shared experiences that create a connection unlike any other. Donna and Linda had spent their lives creating exactly that kind of bond. Family members later spoke of ordinary moments, holiday celebrations, conversations over meals, simple interactions that seemed insignificant at the time but became priceless after their deaths. That is one of the cruelest aspects of violent crime. It transforms ordinary memories into treasures. Suddenly, a routine conversation becomes the last conversation. A casual goodbye becomes the final goodbye. Small moments become sacred. The sisters lived in a world that still believed home was a place of safety, a place where danger remained outside, a place where walls and locked doors provided protection. But killers do not respect such boundaries. When violence entered their lives, it shattered far more than physical security. It destroyed the sense of safety shared by an entire community. The discovery of what happened to Donna and Linda left investigators stunned. Many officers had spent years working difficult cases. Yet even among experienced law enforcement personnel, the brutality stood out. The level of violence suggested something deeply disturbing. Something escalating. Something becoming more dangerous with every crime. News spread rapidly. By then, residents were already frightened because of Annie Flam's murder. The deaths of Donna and Linda intensified those fears dramatically. People no longer viewed Alan Legere as merely an escaped prisoner. He had become something else. A predator. A hunter. Someone capable of appearing anywhere. Parents began changing routines. Children were instructed not to travel alone. People who had lived peacefully for decades suddenly viewed strangers with suspicion. The social fabric of the community was beginning to change. And then came the murder that many residents still describe as the moment fear reached its highest point. Father James Smith, 69 years old, a respected priest, a man who had spent much of his life serving others. For countless people, Father Smith represented stability, guidance, compassion. His church was more than a building. It was a gathering place, a source of comfort, a place where people sought hope during difficult times. He had baptized children, presided over weddings, comforted grieving families, visited the sick, helped those in need. His presence was woven into the life of the community. Many residents could not remember a time when Father Smith had not been there. People trusted him, respected him, loved him. That trust made what happened next even more devastating. When news spread that Father Smith had been murdered, disbelief quickly turned into outrage. Residents struggled to process it. If a priest could become a victim, then nobody was beyond reach. Nobody was protected. The murder seemed to destroy the final illusion that the violence might somehow spare certain people. The community entered a state of collective anxiety unlike anything it had experienced before. Church attendance increased, not because people felt safe, but because they needed comfort, needed answers, needed reassurance. Yet answers were difficult to find, because Alan Legere remained free, somewhere beyond the reach of police, somewhere hidden among forests, rivers, abandoned buildings, and rural roads. And as each new victim was mourned, one terrible reality became impossible to ignore. These were not random names in newspaper articles. They were real people, people whose lives mattered, people who had families waiting for them, people who had plans for the future, people who woke up expecting an ordinary day and never saw another sunrise. For every victim, there were grieving relatives left behind, children who lost parents, siblings who lost brothers and sisters, friends who lost lifelong companions, entire communities forced to carry the weight of collective grief. Long after the headlines faded, those losses remained. Because while society often remembers serial murder cases through the lens of the killer, the true story belongs to the victims. Their lives, their memories, their humanity. And in the dark months of 1989, as fear spread across New Brunswick and the manhunt intensified, the people of Miramichi carried with them the faces of Annie Flam, Donna Donnie, Linda Donnie, and Father James Smith. Not merely as victims, but as neighbors, as friends, as loved ones, as human beings whose stories deserve to be remembered long after the hunt for Alan Legere finally came to an end. The summer of 1989 arrived in New Brunswick with long daylight hours and the familiar rhythm of rural life. Fishing boats moved across rivers before sunrise. Farmers worked fields beneath open skies. Children rode bicycles down quiet roads lined with trees. To an outsider, the region appeared peaceful, almost untouched by the darker realities that haunted larger cities. Yet somewhere beyond the sight of ordinary citizens, a convicted murderer was moving through the province. Alan Legere had escaped. At first, many residents believed the situation would be temporary. Escaped prisoners were usually caught. Police departments had procedures. Roadblocks could be established. Search teams could be organized. The public trusted that authorities would locate him before long. Days passed, then weeks. The reassuring headlines never came. Instead, uncertainty grew. The forests of New Brunswick seemed endless. Thousands of square kilometers of wilderness stretched across the province. Dense trees concealed abandoned camps, forgotten trails, and isolated clearings. For someone desperate to avoid capture, the landscape offered countless hiding places. Legere knew that. Every day, he remained free increased the pressure on investigators and intensified the anxiety spreading through local communities. Then, during the early weeks following his escape, the fear that had existed mostly in imagination suddenly became real. For Annie Flam, the day began like countless others before it. The elderly woman followed familiar routines. The small details of daily life filled the hours. Simple tasks, quiet moments, the comforting predictability that often comes with age. Nothing suggested she was living through the final chapter of her life. As evening approached, the countryside settled into silence. Rural nights possess a unique darkness. Unlike cities, there are few streetlights, few passing vehicles, few distractions. When night arrives, it arrives completely. Inside her home, Annie was surrounded by familiar possessions collected over decades. Family photographs, furniture worn smooth by years of use, memories embedded in every room. It should have been the safest place in the world. Instead, it became the setting for unimaginable violence. At some point during the night, Alan Legere entered her home. The details that investigators would later uncover painted a horrifying picture. This was not a quick theft. This was not a desperate fugitive searching only for supplies. The violence inflicted upon Annie was extreme, excessive, personal, the kind of violence that leaves experienced detectives struggling to understand what could motivate such cruelty. When the attack was over, a 75-year-old woman who had spent decades building a life within her community was gone. The following day, the discovery sent shockwaves through the region. News traveled quickly. Small communities have their own communication networks. Information moves from neighbor to neighbor, from family member to family member. People heard fragments first. Something terrible had happened. An elderly woman had been killed. The escaped prisoner might be responsible. By the time official confirmation arrived, fear had already begun spreading. Doors that had remained unlocked for generations were suddenly secured. Porch lights stayed on throughout the night. Residents checked windows repeatedly before going to bed. For the first time, many people considered the possibility that Alan Legere was not merely hiding. He was hunting, and the realization was terrifying. Yet the nightmare was only beginning. As investigators worked to process the crime scene and gather evidence, Legere remained free. The province watched nervously. Every passing day increased the sense of dread. People wanted answers. Where was he? How was he surviving? Would he strike again? No one could say. Then came another attack. Another family shattered. Another community forced to confront the reality that the violence was escalating. Donna and Linda Donnie were sisters. Like many siblings who spend their lives close to one another, their connection had been built through decades of shared experiences. Family gatherings, holiday celebrations, ordinary conversations, the countless moments that create bonds impossible to replace. Those bonds made what happened next especially devastating. When violence entered their lives, it did not affect only two individuals. It affected everyone who loved them. The attack itself revealed something increasingly disturbing about the fugitive moving through New Brunswick. The brutality was escalating. Investigators noticed it immediately. Experienced officers often learn to recognize patterns. Certain crimes suggest panic. Others suggest planning. Some reveal anger. Others reveal control. The scenes connected to Legere displayed a level of violence that suggested something darker than simple survival. The attacks appeared fueled by rage. A rage that seemed to intensify with each crime. When authorities discovered what had happened, many investigators were visibly shaken. Some had spent years working homicide cases, yet the level of violence still shocked them. People changed routines almost overnight. Parents stopped allowing children to travel alone. Neighbors checked on elderly residents more frequently. Businesses adjusted operating hours. Entire communities began organizing informal security measures. Residents took turns watching neighborhoods. Some kept lights on throughout the night. Others slept with weapons nearby. The psychological impact became impossible to ignore. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted attention. Every stranger became suspicious. Every unexplained sound triggered anxiety. The fear no longer belonged solely to the victims' families. It belonged to everyone. And then came the murder that pushed the region to its breaking point. Father James Smith, a priest, a community leader, a man known for compassion and service. In many ways, he represented the moral center of the area. People sought his guidance during difficult times. He visited the sick, comforted grieving families, helped those facing hardship. His presence carried a sense of stability. For decades, he had been part of the community's most important moments. Births, weddings, funerals, celebrations, tragedies. When residents imagined the people least likely to become victims of violence, many would have thought of someone like Father Smith. That illusion ended when Alan Legere entered his life. The attack shocked New Brunswick on a level few crimes ever achieve. Residents struggled to comprehend what had happened. The murder of an elderly priest felt like an assault on the entire community. The details emerging from the investigation only deepened public horror. Newspapers filled with updates. Television crews arrived. Radio stations interrupted programming. Conversations throughout the province centered on a single topic. Alan Legere. His name became impossible to escape. Children overheard adults discussing him. Business owners talked about him with customers. Church members whispered about him after services. Fear became part of everyday life. By late summer and early autumn, the atmosphere throughout Miramichi had changed dramatically. The region no longer felt familiar. It felt occupied by uncertainty, occupied by fear, occupied by the knowledge that somewhere nearby, a killer remained free. The psychological strain affected nearly everyone. Residents reported difficulty sleeping. Many became hypervigilant. Some avoided leaving home after dark entirely. Others carried flashlights, even during short walks. Halloween approached, a holiday normally associated with excitement and community celebrations. But in 1989, many parents faced an impossible question. Was it safe to allow children outside? The fact that such a question even existed demonstrated how thoroughly fear had transformed daily life. Stories spread rapidly. Some were true. Others were rumors. Possible sightings emerged constantly. One person claimed to have seen Legere near a rural road. Another reported suspicious movement near a forest edge. Police investigated countless leads. Most produced nothing. Yet every report reinforced the same reality. He was still out there, still moving, still evading capture. Meanwhile, investigators worked around the clock. Each crime scene offered clues. Each witness statement added another piece to the puzzle. But the province remained trapped in a cycle of anticipation and dread. Every morning people wondered whether another attack had occurred during the night. Every evening families prepared themselves for the possibility that the nightmare would continue. Because serial violence creates a unique form of terror. The next victim is unknown. The next location is unknown. The next moment is unknown. Everyone becomes a potential target. As weeks turned into months, Alan Legere's crimes transformed him from an escaped convict into something far more frightening in the public imagination. He became a symbol of unpredictability, a symbol of vulnerability, a symbol of how quickly safety can disappear. The peaceful communities of New Brunswick had spent generations believing violence belonged elsewhere. Now violence was here, walking their roads, crossing their forests, hiding in their shadows, and before the nightmare reached its conclusion, the largest manhunt in provincial history would push investigators to their limits. Because somewhere beyond the fear, beyond the grief, and beyond the growing media attention, a breakthrough was slowly approaching. A breakthrough that would eventually bring one of Canada's most notorious killers to justice. But first, the province would endure months of uncertainty unlike anything it had experienced before. The first thing investigators noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a rural home tucked away from busy roads, but the unsettling silence that often lingers after violence. The kind that seems unnatural. The kind that makes experienced officers slow their steps as they enter a scene. When police arrived at the home of Annie Flam, they already knew something was wrong. Neighbors had become concerned. Messages had gone unanswered. The routines that normally defined her life had been interrupted. For elderly residents living alone, routine often serves as a form of communication with the outside world. People notice when curtains remain closed. They notice when a familiar face fails to appear. They notice when something feels different. That awareness led authorities to Annie's home. What they discovered would become the first major crime scene connected to Alan Legere's reign of terror after his escape. Investigators entered cautiously. Even before the full details emerged, the atmosphere inside the residence felt wrong. Homes tell stories about the people who live in them. Photographs displayed on shelves, reading glasses resting beside chairs, family keepsakes collected over decades. These ordinary objects often create a sense of warmth. But when violence enters such a space, the contrast becomes disturbing. The evidence quickly revealed that Annie had not died of natural causes. The scene spoke of struggle, of fear, of brutality. Veteran investigators exchanged grim looks. Many had worked homicide cases before. Yet certain crime scenes leave a deeper impression than others. This was one of them. Photographers documented every detail. Forensic specialists carefully collected evidence. Measurements were taken. Samples were secured. Nothing could be overlooked. Because somewhere beyond the boundaries of that property, a killer remained free. At that stage, investigators already knew about Alan Legere's escape. His name immediately entered discussions. The possibility that a convicted murderer had committed another violent crime transformed the investigation from a local homicide into a matter of urgent public safety. News traveled rapidly. Within hours, officers were conducting interviews. Neighbors were questioned. Potential witnesses were identified. Every movement near the property became important. Every unusual observation was documented. Yet despite the growing suspicion surrounding Legere, detectives faced a familiar challenge. Suspicion alone was not enough. Evidence would be required. Proof would be required. And at that moment, the proof remained incomplete. As investigators processed Annie Flam's home, another realization began to emerge. The violence was excessive. This observation mattered. Experienced homicide detectives often study not only what happened but how it happened. The level of force used can reveal important clues about an offender's mindset. In this case, the brutality suggested something beyond simple robbery. Something personal. Something fueled by rage. That conclusion deeply concerned investigators, because offenders driven by intense violence frequently become repeat offenders. The fear was difficult to ignore. What if this was only the beginning? Unfortunately, those fears proved justified. As the investigation expanded, New Brunswick entered a period unlike anything in its recent history. Police resources were stretched across multiple jurisdictions. Tips flooded in from concerned citizens. Every reported sighting generated new leads. Some appeared promising. Most led nowhere. The forests remained vast. The rural landscape offered countless hiding places. Meanwhile, public anxiety continued growing. Then came another crime scene. And another. Each discovery intensified the pressure. Each discovery deepened the sense of urgency. When authorities arrived at locations connected to later victims, the atmosphere was often similar. Initial confusion, rapid assessment, the growing realization that another act of extreme violence had occurred. Then, the painstaking process of documentation. Crime scene investigators worked methodically. Every footprint mattered. Every fingerprint mattered. Every fiber, hair, stain, or discarded object carried potential significance. The challenge was enormous. Unlike modern investigations supported by advanced digital surveillance, investigators in 1989 relied heavily on physical evidence and witness accounts. Cell phones did not track movements. Security cameras were far less common. There were no social media posts to analyze. Finding a fugitive often depended on traditional police work. And traditional police work required patience. Hours became days. Days became weeks. The pressure mounted relentlessly. One of the most significant discoveries emerged through the careful comparison of evidence from multiple crime scenes. Patterns began to appear. Investigators noticed similarities. Certain behaviors repeated. Certain methods connected the crimes. Individually, each clue seemed small. Together, they painted a picture. The picture was terrifying. The same offender was almost certainly responsible. The murders were linked. And that offender was likely Alan Legere. The public did not know every detail investigators possessed. Authorities intentionally withheld certain information. This is a common investigative strategy. Specific details can help verify confessions, eliminate false leads, and strengthen prosecutions. But even without knowing everything, residents understood enough. The danger was real. The killings were connected. The killer remained free. As the investigation expanded, command centers became increasingly active. Maps covered walls. Photographs were pinned to boards. Officers reviewed timelines repeatedly. Where had Legere been seen? Which routes might he be using? Who might be helping him? The search became both a criminal investigation and a strategic exercise. Every clue was analyzed. Every possibility explored. At times, exhaustion became visible. Many investigators worked long hours with little rest. Families of victims demanded answers. Communities demanded protection. The media demanded updates. The pressure never disappeared. Yet amid the frustration, important evidence continued to accumulate. Witnesses reported suspicious activity. Physical evidence linked locations. Timelines narrowed. The picture slowly became clearer. Still, clarity did not equal capture. Legere remained elusive. For every lead that appeared promising, another dead end emerged. For every report placing him in one location, another suggested he was somewhere else. The uncertainty proved maddening. Some officers later described the experience as chasing a ghost. Not because Legere was invisible, but because he seemed capable of slipping away whenever authorities got close. Then came the murder of Father James Smith. For investigators, this crime represented a turning point. Not merely because of the victim's prominence within the community, but because of what it revealed. The killer's confidence appeared to be growing. The attacks were becoming increasingly bold. This realization intensified fears among law enforcement. Serial offenders sometimes escalate. The longer they avoid capture, the more dangerous they become. The evidence suggested that possibility was becoming reality. Following Father Smith's murder, investigative efforts increased dramatically. Resources from multiple agencies were coordinated. Specialized personnel joined the effort. Information sharing became more extensive. The search transformed into one of the largest manhunts New Brunswick had ever seen. Yet even as the operation expanded, the investigation continued relying on careful forensic work. Every crime scene held secrets. Every piece of evidence carried potential value. Investigators understood that solving the case might ultimately depend on details invisible to the naked eye. Tiny fragments, microscopic traces, physical evidence that could survive even when witnesses could not. At the time, a revolutionary forensic tool was beginning to attract attention within scientific circles. DNA analysis. The technology remained relatively new. Its capabilities were not yet fully understood by the general public. Many investigators had limited experience using it, yet some experts believed it represented the future of criminal investigations. As evidence accumulated from the various crime scenes connected to Legere, the possibility of using DNA became increasingly important. The science was still evolving. The legal system was still adapting. But a new era was approaching. Most people living in New Brunswick had no idea that the investigation unfolding around them would soon become part of Canadian forensic history. For now, they focused on more immediate concerns: locking doors, protecting families, watching the news, waiting for answers. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together a puzzle stained with blood and fear. Each crime scene offered another fragment. Each discovery added another layer. Each victim brought detectives closer to understanding the man they were hunting. The evidence was growing. The picture was becoming clearer. And somewhere within that growing mountain of information lay the key that would eventually bring Alan Legere's months of terror to an end. The question was whether investigators could find that key before another life was lost. By the autumn of 1989, fear had become a permanent resident of the Miramichi region. People no longer spoke about Alan Legere as an escaped convict. He had become something else entirely. A shadow moving through forests. A name parents whispered after dark. A threat that seemed capable of appearing anywhere at any time. For investigators, however, fear could not become a distraction. While communities struggled with anxiety and grief, detectives faced a different challenge. They had to find a man who appeared to be staying one step ahead of everyone. Every morning began with new reports, possible sightings, anonymous tips, rumors, witness statements. Most led nowhere. Some seemed promising for a few hours before collapsing under scrutiny. Yet each lead had to be examined. No possibility could be ignored. The consequences of overlooking the right clue were simply too great. Inside temporary command centers established during the manhunt, walls became covered with maps. Colored markers identified reported sightings. Photographs of victims hung beside timelines. Investigators moved from one table to another, carrying folders filled with reports. Coffee cups accumulated beside stacks of paperwork. The atmosphere was tense, not dramatic in the cinematic sense, not filled with shouting or sudden breakthroughs. Instead, it was the quiet tension of people carrying enormous responsibility. Every officer understood what was at stake. Another mistake could cost another life. The first major obstacle was geography. New Brunswick offered countless places where a fugitive could hide. The province contained dense forests stretching for miles, abandoned cabins, logging roads, remote camps, vacant structures. Even experienced search teams struggled to cover such vast terrain. Helicopters scanned wooded areas from above. Ground teams searched on foot. Police dogs tracked scents through difficult conditions. Yet nature often favored the fugitive. Trees concealed movement. Weather erased tracks. Distance complicated communication. Many officers later admitted that the environment itself felt like an accomplice. Every valley, every forest trail, every isolated road seemed to provide another opportunity for Legere to disappear. As the search expanded, investigators developed profiles of his likely behavior. What kind of locations would he choose? Would he seek populated areas or avoid them? Was he receiving assistance from someone? Could he be stealing supplies? How long could he realistically survive while constantly moving? Criminal profilers and investigators debated these questions repeatedly. No answer felt completely certain. Leger did not fit neatly into expectations. His actions were often unpredictable. One moment he seemed cautious, the next, astonishingly bold. This unpredictability complicated every aspect of the investigation. Meanwhile, residents remained on edge. Many people began reporting anything unusual. A strange vehicle parked near a road, footprints behind a house, an unfamiliar person walking through a neighborhood. The volume of information became overwhelming. Investigators worked tirelessly to separate valuable leads from harmless misunderstandings. The pressure from the public was immense. Families wanted reassurance. Communities demanded protection. Local leaders sought answers. Yet answers remained frustratingly scarce. Every day Leger remained free increased criticism of law enforcement. Some residents questioned whether enough resources were being deployed. Others wondered if authorities had overlooked important clues. Such criticism is common during major manhunts. Fear creates urgency. Urgency creates frustration. And frustration often seeks a target. Police found themselves balancing two battles simultaneously. One against the fugitive, another against the growing perception that he could not be caught. The media amplified that perception. Newspapers published frequent updates. Television crews arrived from outside the province. Reporters interviewed frightened residents. Every development became headline material. The story was no longer local. It was becoming national. Canadians across the country followed the case. Many were astonished that one man had managed to evade such a large operation for so long. Inside investigative meetings, detectives began revisiting older information. Sometimes major breakthroughs emerged not from new evidence, but from re-examining existing evidence. Witness interviews were reviewed again. Timelines were reconstructed. Travel routes were analyzed repeatedly. Every assumption faced scrutiny. Investigators understood that somewhere within the mountain of information, something important might be hiding. Yet despite these efforts, progress often felt painfully slow. One day officers would receive a promising lead suggesting Leger had been seen near a rural property. Resources would be deployed. Search teams would mobilize. Hours later the lead would collapse. Another dead end. Another disappointment. The emotional toll on investigators became significant. Many had spent months pursuing the same fugitive. Sleep became irregular. Stress accumulated. Families saw less of them. Yet they continued, because every officer involved knew the victims deserved justice, and because everyone feared what might happen if the manhunt failed. The murders themselves complicated the investigation further. Each crime scene required extensive forensic examination. Specialists collected evidence carefully. Laboratories processed samples. Experts compared findings. The challenge was that forensic science in 1989 was undergoing a period of transformation. Many techniques relied heavily on traditional methods. Fingerprints, hair analysis, fiber comparisons, blood typing. These tools remained valuable, but investigators increasingly recognized their limitations. Evidence could suggest possibilities. It could narrow suspects, but proving guilt beyond doubt often remained difficult, particularly when dealing with a fugitive constantly moving between locations. At the same time, another challenge emerged. Fear itself. The public's fear was understandable, but it sometimes interfered with the investigation. False sightings multiplied. Rumors spread rapidly. Some communities became convinced Leger was hiding nearby despite no evidence supporting the belief. Each rumor demanded attention. Each report consumed resources. Investigators could not afford to dismiss possibilities outright. Yet they also could not chase every shadow indefinitely. Balancing caution and efficiency became a daily struggle. As weeks passed, Halloween approached. Under normal circumstances, communities across New Brunswick would have prepared for celebrations. Children would select costumes. Families would decorate homes. Neighborhoods would welcome groups of young trick-or-treaters. In 1989, everything felt different. Parents worried openly. Some limited their children's activities. Others canceled plans entirely. The presence of an escaped murderer transformed a holiday associated with fun into another source of anxiety. Many residents later described that Halloween as one of the strangest periods they could remember. The fear was not abstract. It felt personal, immediate, close, because nobody knew where Leger might appear next. Investigators understood this public anxiety. They felt it too, not as citizens alone, but as professionals carrying responsibility for ending the nightmare. Meetings became increasingly focused. Strategies evolved. Resources were reassigned. Search patterns changed. Authorities expanded cooperation across agencies. Every available tool was being utilized. Still, the fugitive remained elusive. There were moments when some officers feared the manhunt might continue indefinitely. History contains examples of fugitives avoiding capture for years. The possibility could not be ignored. Yet investigators also knew something else. Few criminals remain lucky forever. Eventually mistakes occur. Eventually patterns emerge. Eventually evidence accumulates. And in the Leger case, evidence was slowly building beneath the surface. What investigators did not yet fully realize was that they were standing at the edge of a revolutionary change in criminal justice. A scientific development that would soon transform the case. A development capable of connecting offenders to crimes with unprecedented accuracy. DNA analysis. At the time, many Canadians had never heard the term. Some investigators possessed only limited familiarity with the technology. Others viewed it cautiously. The science was relatively new. The legal implications remained uncertain. Courts had little experience handling such evidence. Yet among forensic experts, excitement was growing. Because DNA offered something previous methods often could not. Individual identification with extraordinary precision. As evidence from the Leger investigation continued moving through forensic channels, certain specialists began recognizing the potential significance of this emerging technology. The implications were enormous, not only for the current manhunt, but for the future of criminal investigations throughout Canada. For now, however, those possibilities remained largely hidden from public view. Residents continued locking doors. Police continued searching forests. Investigators continued reviewing reports. And Alan Leger continued running. The manhunt had become a contest of endurance, a battle between a fugitive determined to remain free and an investigative force determined to stop him. Neither side knew exactly when the confrontation would end. But behind the scenes, the pieces of a breakthrough were beginning to come together. Slowly, quietly, and far closer than anyone realized. By November 1989, nearly 7 months had passed since Alan Leger escaped custody. 7 months of fear. 7 months of uncertainty. 7 months during which an entire region of New Brunswick had learned to live with the possibility that a killer could be hiding just beyond the tree line. For investigators, those months felt even longer. Every lead had been pursued, every rumor examined, every possible sighting investigated. Hundreds of officers had participated in the search. Helicopters had crossed the skies above forests and rural communities countless times. Roadblocks had appeared on highways and secondary roads. Search dogs had followed tracks through mud, rain, and eventually snow. Yet despite all those efforts, Alan Leger remained free, at least for a while. What nobody realized at the beginning of the manhunt was that the breakthrough would not come from a dramatic shootout in the woods or a chance encounter at a roadside diner. Instead, it would emerge from persistence, from the slow accumulation of evidence, from investigators refusing to stop looking, and from a scientific revolution that was only beginning to reveal its potential. As autumn deepened across New Brunswick, temperatures dropped steadily. The forests that had provided cover throughout the summer were changing. Leaves fell from branches. Vegetation thinned. Concealment became more difficult. The environment that had protected the fugitive for months slowly began turning against him. Meanwhile, investigators noticed something else. Patterns. Criminals often believe they are acting unpredictably. Yet over time, patterns emerge. Movement patterns, behavioral patterns, decision-making patterns. Leger was no exception. By carefully analyzing reports gathered over several months, investigators began narrowing their focus. Certain areas appeared repeatedly. Certain routes seemed more likely than others. Certain behaviors suggested how he obtained food, transportation, and temporary shelter. The picture was still incomplete, but it was becoming clearer. Inside command centers, maps became increasingly crowded with information. Colored pins marked sightings. Lines connected locations. Dates and times were reviewed repeatedly. What had once looked like chaos slowly began revealing structure. Every new piece of information mattered. Even details that initially appeared insignificant could prove important when combined with other evidence. Investigators worked through long nights. Many barely saw their families. The pressure remained enormous. The public wanted answers. Victims' families wanted justice. The province wanted the nightmare to end. Then came a series of developments that changed everything. Reports emerged suggesting Leger had been seen near specific rural locations. Unlike many previous sightings, these reports contained details investigators found credible. Witnesses described behaviors and circumstances that aligned with known information. The leads were not dismissed. They were pursued aggressively. Surveillance increased. Search teams adjusted their deployment strategies. Resources were concentrated more carefully than before. For the first time in months, some investigators felt they were genuinely closing in. Still, caution remained necessary. The manhunt had produced false hope before. Promising leads had collapsed. Strong theories had failed. Nobody wanted to celebrate prematurely. Meanwhile, Leger continued moving. But something had changed. The confidence that may have helped him survive for months was beginning to create vulnerabilities. Long-term fugitives often become victims of their own success. The longer they evade capture, the more risks they take. The more comfortable they become. The more opportunities they create for mistakes. Investigators believed that process might finally be occurring. Then came November 24, 1989. The date would become one of the most important days in modern Canadian criminal history. The events unfolded rapidly. Information reached authorities that suggested Leger was nearby. Police mobilized quickly. Units moved into position. Roads were monitored. Search teams coordinated their efforts. The atmosphere among officers was tense. Months of frustration had led to this moment. Nobody wanted him to slip away again. As police closed in, the operation intensified. Vehicles moved across rural roads. Communications crackled constantly. Officers relayed updates in real time. The search area narrowed. The possibility that the fugitive was finally within reach became increasingly real. Then the breakthrough became reality. After months of fear, months of violence, and months of uncertainty, Alan Leger was captured. The arrest itself brought an enormous sense of relief. Not only for investigators, not only for victims' families, but for entire communities. For the first time in months, residents could imagine a future without constant fear. The news spread rapidly. Telephones rang throughout the province. Television stations interrupted programming. Radio broadcasts delivered updates. People who had spent months checking locks before bed suddenly felt a burden lifting from their shoulders. The nightmare was not entirely over. Trials still lay ahead. Evidence still needed to be presented. Families still carried grief that would never disappear. But the immediate threat had finally ended. The man responsible for months of terror was back in custody. For many communities, the announcement felt almost surreal. Fear had become so deeply embedded in daily life that some residents struggled to believe the manhunt was truly over. Yet another battle was only beginning. Because capturing Alan Leger and convicting Alan Leger were two different challenges. Investigators still needed to prove their case. And proving that case would ultimately transform Canadian legal history. As prosecutors prepared for trial, forensic experts continued examining evidence collected throughout the investigation. This evidence included biological material recovered from crime scenes. Today, such analysis might seem routine. In 1989, it was anything but routine. A revolutionary technology was emerging. DNA profiling. At the time, many people barely understood what DNA was. The science was still relatively new. Courts had limited experience evaluating it. Defense attorneys questioned its reliability. Some legal experts remained skeptical. Yet forensic scientists recognized its extraordinary potential. Unlike many traditional forms of evidence, DNA offered something remarkable: individual identification with unprecedented accuracy, a biological fingerprint, a method capable of linking a suspect to a crime scene with a level of certainty previously impossible. The Legere case would become one of the first major tests of that technology within the Canadian justice system. Scientists carefully examined biological evidence connected to the murders. Laboratory procedures were conducted with extreme caution. Every step faced scrutiny. The stakes were enormous. If successful, the results could help secure convictions. If unsuccessful, confidence in the emerging science might suffer a major setback. For investigators who had spent months pursuing the fugitive, the development represented another form of breakthrough. The capture had ended the manhunt. The science might help secure justice. As laboratory work progressed, anticipation grew. Prosecutors recognized the significance. Defense teams understood the implications. Legal observers watched closely. The case was becoming more than a murder trial. It was becoming a landmark moment, a confrontation between traditional criminal investigations and the future of forensic science. Meanwhile, families of the victims waited. For them, discussions about scientific methods and legal precedent were secondary. They wanted accountability. They wanted answers. They wanted the man responsible for so much suffering to face consequences. Every court hearing brought renewed emotion. Every public update reopened wounds. Yet many families remained determined to see the process through. Their loved ones deserved nothing less. Looking back decades later, historians often describe the capture of Alan Legere as the moment the nightmare ended. In one sense, that is true. The killing stopped. The fear gradually receded. Communities began healing. Children once again played outside without parents constantly watching the road. Residents slowly returned to normal routines. Life moved forward. But another perspective is equally important. The capture marked the beginning of something larger. A new era in criminal justice. An era where DNA evidence would revolutionize investigations around the world. An era where science could speak for victims who no longer could. And in the months that followed, as prosecutors prepared their case against one of Canada's most feared killers, that science would take center stage. The forests of New Brunswick had hidden Alan Legere for months. But eventually, evidence proved more persistent than any fugitive. And evidence was about to tell a story that even the most skilled defense could not easily silence. When Alan Legere was finally returned to custody, many people across New Brunswick experienced a sense of relief they had not felt in months. The immediate danger was gone. The nightly fear that had settled over homes throughout the Miramichi region slowly began to fade. Parents no longer watched every unfamiliar vehicle with suspicion. Residents no longer scanned tree lines, each evening wondering whether a killer might be hiding nearby. For the first time since May 1989, communities could begin imagining a return to normal life. But relief was not the same as closure. The arrests, the roadblocks, the helicopter searches, and the endless weeks of fear had all led to a single destination. The courtroom. That was where the final battle would occur. Not in forests, not on rural roads, not during manhunts, but before judges, lawyers, forensic experts, journalists, and the families whose lives had been forever changed by violence. As preparations for trial began, prosecutors faced an enormous responsibility. This was not merely another murder case. The crimes had terrorized an entire region. The public expected accountability. The victims' families expected justice. And investigators who had dedicated months of their lives to the manhunt expected the evidence they had collected to withstand intense scrutiny. The challenge was significant. Criminal trials demand proof, not assumptions, not public opinion, not reputation. Evidence. Every detail would be examined, every witness questioned, every forensic finding challenged. The legal system requires certainty because the consequences are so serious. For prosecutors, the goal was clear. Demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that Alan Legere was responsible for the murders committed during his escape. For the defense, the objective was equally clear. Challenge the evidence. Question the conclusions. Create uncertainty wherever possible. The courtroom became the next battlefield. When proceedings began, public interest was enormous. Journalists filled seats reserved for the media. News organizations across Canada followed developments closely. Each day brought new reports. Each testimony generated discussion. Each piece of evidence was analyzed by commentators and legal observers. Many residents who had lived through the fear of 1989 followed every update. For them, the trial represented more than a legal proceeding. It represented the final chapter of a nightmare. The atmosphere inside the courtroom often felt heavy. Victims' families sat only a short distance from the man accused of causing unimaginable pain. Some listened quietly. Others struggled to contain emotion. Every description of the crimes reopened wounds. Every photograph introduced as evidence revived painful memories. Trials can be exhausting experiences for families. Justice requires confronting facts. And facts are often painful. The prosecution began presenting the case methodically. Witnesses described events connected to the investigation. Law enforcement officers explained the manhunt. Experts discussed evidence recovered from crime scenes. The story that had unfolded across New Brunswick was reconstructed piece by piece. Jurors were asked to examine not only individual facts, but the broader picture those facts created. Each witness added another layer. Each document contributed another detail. Each testimony strengthened the narrative investigators had spent months building. Yet one aspect of the trial attracted particular attention: DNA evidence. Today, most people recognize DNA analysis as a routine part of criminal investigations. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the situation was very different. The technology was new. Many members of the public knew little about it. Even legal professionals were still learning how it should be presented and evaluated. For that reason, the Leger trial became historically significant. The courtroom was not simply evaluating a murder case. It was evaluating the future of forensic science within the Canadian justice system. Experts took the stand to explain concepts that were unfamiliar to many observers. They described how DNA could be extracted and compared. They explained how biological evidence recovered from crime scenes could be analyzed. They discussed probabilities and scientific reliability. Some testimony was highly technical, yet its importance was impossible to ignore. Forensic science was offering something investigators had never possessed before: a way to connect evidence to individuals with extraordinary precision. The defense challenged the science aggressively. That was expected. New technologies often face skepticism. Questions were raised about procedures. Questions were raised about interpretation. Questions were raised about reliability. The courtroom became a place where science itself was being tested. Would judges and jurors trust this emerging technology? Could DNA evidence withstand legal scrutiny? The answers would influence criminal investigations far beyond New Brunswick. As testimony continued, prosecutors remained focused on building a comprehensive case. The goal was not to rely on a single piece of evidence. The goal was to show how all the evidence fit together. Witness statements, physical evidence, investigative findings, scientific analysis. Individually, each element carried significance. Together, they formed a powerful argument. Outside the courtroom, public interest remained intense. People gathered around televisions to watch reports. Newspapers published extensive coverage. Radio programs discussed daily developments. For many Canadians, the case had become both a criminal trial and a lesson in the future of forensic science. Victims' families endured every stage of the process. Listening to details about crimes committed against loved ones required enormous strength. Many had already spent years carrying grief. Now they were asked to relive portions of that grief within a courtroom. Some family members later described the experience as emotionally exhausting. Necessary, but exhausting. Justice often demands patience, and patience can be difficult when loss remains so profound. As the trial progressed, a growing sense emerged that the evidence was compelling. The prosecution's case was extensive. Investigators had spent enormous effort assembling it. Experts had explained the forensic findings in detail. Witnesses had contributed crucial information. The picture presented to the court became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Eventually, the proceedings moved toward conclusion. Arguments were delivered. Evidence was reviewed. Jurors considered what they had heard. For everyone involved, the waiting was agonizing. Months of investigation had led to this point. Years of grief had led to this point. Entire communities waited for an answer. Then the verdict arrived. Alan Legere was found guilty. For many families, the moment brought complicated emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, exhaustion. No verdict could restore lives that had been taken. No sentence could erase memories of violence. No courtroom decision could completely heal the damage left behind. Yet accountability matters. The legal system cannot undo tragedy. Its purpose is to recognize responsibility, to establish truth, to ensure consequences. The guilty verdict represented that recognition. The court formally concluded that Alan Legere was responsible for the murders committed during his escape. The man who had terrorized New Brunswick would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Life imprisonment ensured that society would be protected from further violence. Parole boards later reviewed his status repeatedly over the years. Again and again, concerns about risk and dangerousness remained central. Release was denied. The man who had spent months evading authorities would never regain his freedom. Beyond the verdict itself, the case left another legacy. The successful use of DNA evidence helped transform Canadian criminal justice. What had once been viewed as an experimental technology quickly became one of the most important investigative tools in the world. Future homicide investigations would rely on it. Future victims would receive justice because of it. Future offenders would be identified because of it. The courtroom battle involving Alan Legere helped accelerate that transformation. In that sense, the trial changed more than one man's future. It changed the future of forensic investigations throughout Canada. Yet for the families who sat through every hearing, every testimony, and every legal argument, the most important outcome was far simpler. The man responsible had been held accountable. The nightmare that began with a prison escape had finally reached its legal conclusion. The forests were quiet again. The roadblocks were gone. The helicopters had disappeared from the sky. And after years of fear, grief, and uncertainty, justice had finally spoken. When a serial killer is finally convicted, newspapers often treat the verdict as the ending. The headline is written. The sentence is announced. The prison doors close. The cameras leave. To the outside world, the story appears finished. But for the people who live through it, the real ending is rarely that simple. In New Brunswick, the capture and conviction of Alan Legere did not erase what had happened during those 7 months in 1989. The forests remained the same. The rivers continued flowing. The small communities of the Miramichi region carried on with daily life. Yet something had changed beneath the surface. Something invisible. Something that could not be repaired by a courtroom verdict. Memory. Years after the manhunt ended, many residents could still remember exactly where they were when they first heard that Legere had escaped. They remember the conversations. They remember the warnings. They remembered the growing realization that a dangerous man was moving freely through their communities. Fear leaves traces, not physical traces like fingerprints or footprints. Psychological traces, the kind that linger long after the immediate danger has disappeared. For many families, ordinary routines took time to return. People who had once left doors unlocked began locking them every night. Residents who had never thought twice about answering a knock after dark became cautious. Parents who once allowed children greater freedom became more protective. The changes were subtle, but they were real. Entire communities had been forced to confront a truth they never expected to face. Violence was not something that happened only in distant places. It could arrive anywhere, even in quiet towns surrounded by forests and rivers, even in communities where neighbors knew each other by name. For the families of the victims, the passage of time brought a different challenge. Public attention gradually faded. Journalists moved on to other stories. Television crews stopped arriving. The world continued turning. Yet grief remained. Birthdays still arrived. Holidays still came. Family gatherings still took place. And every one of those moments carried an absence. A chair that remained empty. A voice that would never be heard again. A future that had been stolen. The victims were often remembered through photographs. Images captured before violence entered their lives. Smiles frozen in time. Ordinary moments transformed into precious memories. Those photographs served as reminders of something important. The victims were not merely names in court documents. They were people. people with families, people with routines, people with dreams, habits, friendships, and histories. The public often remembers serial killers because their crimes dominate headlines. But the true legacy belongs to the lives that were lost. That reality became especially important in the years following the trial. Community members worked to preserve the memory of the victims rather than the notoriety of the offender. Because notoriety can be dangerous. Some killers seek attention. Some crave recognition. Some want their names remembered. The victims deserve that remembrance instead. As years passed, another aspect of the case continued attracting attention. The role of DNA evidence. Legal scholars, investigators, and forensic scientists frequently pointed to the Legere case as a turning point. Today, DNA evidence is considered one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigations. It helps identify offenders. It exonerates innocent people. It solves cold cases. It provides answers that once seemed impossible to obtain. In 1989 and 1991, however, the technology was still proving itself. The Legere trial demonstrated that science could transform justice. A tiny biological sample could reveal truths that witnesses might miss. A microscopic trace could speak louder than speculation. The implications reached far beyond New Brunswick. Across Canada, police agencies began investing more heavily in forensic science. Laboratories expanded capabilities. Investigators received additional training. Future generations of detectives would benefit from lessons learned during the case. In that sense, the victims contributed to something larger than anyone could have imagined. Their case helped change criminal investigations across an entire country. Yet for local residents, the legacy remained deeply personal. People who lived through the manhunt often described it as a defining chapter of regional history. Children who experienced those months grew into adults who still remembered the tension. The roadblocks, the helicopters, the constant news updates, the fear that seemed to settle over every conversation. Many later reflected on how unusual the experience had been. Most communities never endure a prolonged serial killer manhunt. Most residents never spend months wondering whether a murderer is hiding nearby. For those who did, the memories never completely disappeared. Time softened some of the fear, but memory remained. Then the decades began passing. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. Technology changed. Society changed. New generations emerged who knew the story only through documentaries, books, and archived news reports. Meanwhile, Alan Legere remained behind bars. Parole hearings periodically brought the case back into public discussion. Each review reopened old wounds for victims' families. Each hearing reminded communities of crimes they had spent years trying to move beyond. Again and again, authorities concluded that the risks remained too high. Again and again, release was denied. The man whose freedom had once terrorized an entire region would not walk free again. Then, in March 2026, another chapter quietly came to an end. Alan Legere died in prison at the age of 78. The news generated headlines across Canada. For some people, it felt significant. For others, it changed very little. The deaths of the victims had always carried far greater importance than the death of the man who killed them. Still, his passing marked the end of a life defined by violence. A life that left devastation across multiple families. A life that became one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. The reactions varied. Some people viewed the news as the final closing of a long and painful story. Others felt no particular sense of closure at all. Because closure is often misunderstood. It is not a moment. It is not a headline. It is not a single event. For many victims' families, closure never fully arrives. There is healing. There is adaptation. There is resilience. But loss remains. The years simply teach people how to carry it. Looking back now, the Alan Legere case leaves several enduring lessons. The first is the importance of persistence. Investigators spent months pursuing a fugitive who repeatedly escaped capture. Many leads failed. Many searches produced nothing. Yet they continued. Without that persistence, justice might never have been achieved. The second lesson involves science. The case demonstrated the extraordinary power of forensic evidence. What began as an emerging technology eventually transformed criminal justice around the world. Today, Countless investigations rely on tools that were once considered revolutionary. The third lesson is perhaps the most important. Communities matter. Throughout the manhunt, fear threatened to isolate people. Yet many residents responded by helping one another. Neighbors checked on neighbors. Families looked after vulnerable relatives. Communities united against fear rather than surrendering to it. That solidarity became one of the few positive stories to emerge from a dark period. And finally, there is the lesson carried by every true crime story worth telling. Behind every case file are human beings. Behind every statistic is a family. Behind every headline is a life. The victims in this case were not characters in a story. They were real people whose futures were taken from them. Remembering that truth is more important than remembering the killer's name. As the years continue passing, forests still cover the landscapes of New Brunswick. Rivers still flow through the Miramichi region. Small communities continue their routines, much as they always have. Children grow up. Families gather. Life moves forward. Yet somewhere within those communities, memories remain. Memories of fear. Memories of resilience. Memories of lives that deserved far more time than they received. And perhaps that is where the story truly ends. Not with the escape. Not with the murders. Not with the manhunt. Not even with the verdict. It ends with remembrance. Because while violence can take lives, it does not have the power to erase them. The names of the victims endure. The lessons endure. The truth endures. And long after the headlines have faded, that is what remains. Years after Alan Legere disappeared from the headlines, people in the Miramichi region still found themselves returning to the story. Not every day. Not even every year. Sometimes it happened during a conversation between old friends. Sometimes it surfaced when a documentary appeared on television. Sometimes it returned when someone drove past a familiar road and remembered the police checkpoints that once stood there. Memory has a strange way of surviving. Entire generations can grow older, buildings can change, businesses can close, and new families can move into old neighborhoods, yet certain events remain fixed in the collective memory of a community. The summer and autumn of 1989 became one of those events. For those who lived through it, the details never completely disappeared. Many remembered how quickly normal life had changed. One week, people were discussing weather forecasts, fishing conditions, work schedules, and family plans. The next, they were discussing escape routes, police searches, and the possibility that a killer might be hiding nearby. What frightened people most was not simply the violence itself. It was uncertainty. Human beings can adapt to many things. They can endure hardship. They can survive disasters. They can overcome loss. But uncertainty creates a unique form of fear because it leaves questions unanswered. Where is the danger? When will it appear? Who will be affected? For months, nobody could answer those questions. Every sunrise arrived with new possibilities. Every sunset brought renewed anxiety. Parents checked windows before going to bed. Children sensed tension in conversations they were never meant to hear. Elderly residents became more cautious. Entire communities shifted their behavior without even realizing it. When historians later examined the Legere case, they often focused on the murders, the escape, the manhunt, or the groundbreaking use of DNA evidence. All of those subjects were important, yet there was another story hidden beneath them. A story about ordinary people, about how communities respond when fear enters their lives. Because despite everything that happened, the people of New Brunswick did not surrender to panic. They adapted. They supported one another. They remained vigilant. Neighbors checked on neighbors. Families looked after elderly relatives. Communities organized themselves in ways both large and small. Fear tried to isolate people. Instead, many became closer. That lesson is easy to overlook when discussing notorious crimes. The spotlight often focuses on offenders, but communities possess stories too. Stories of resilience, stories of courage, stories of people refusing to allow violence to define them. The families of the victims carried perhaps the heaviest burden. For them, history was not an academic subject. It was personal. Every anniversary carried meaning. Every family gathering contained reminders of who should have been there. Time moved forward, but grief rarely follows a straight path. Some days brought peace. Others reopened old wounds. A familiar photograph, a remembered voice, a birthday, A holiday, a simple object found in a drawer years later. Loss often hides in ordinary moments, and yet many families found ways to honor those who were taken from them. They told stories, shared memories, preserved photographs, spoke names. In doing so, they ensured that victims remained more than entries in legal records. They remained mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, friends, neighbors, and loved ones. That distinction matters. Because criminals frequently become infamous, victims deserve to be remembered as human beings. As the decades passed, the world changed dramatically. Technology transformed communication. Forensic science advanced beyond what investigators in 1989 could have imagined. DNA analysis became standard practice. Databases expanded. Cold cases that once seemed impossible to solve suddenly found new life. Countless investigations benefited from lessons learned during earlier cases. Among those earlier cases stood the prosecution of Alan Legere. The significance of that trial extended far beyond one courtroom. At the time, many people could not fully appreciate its long-term impact. Today, it is easier to understand. The acceptance of DNA evidence changed criminal justice forever. It helped convict guilty offenders. It also helped free innocent people who had been wrongly accused. Science became one of the most powerful allies available to investigators seeking truth. In that sense, the case occupies an important place in Canadian legal history. But legal history and human history are not always the same thing. Human history is measured differently. It is measured in lives, in relationships, in consequences that stretch across generations. A child who lost a parent in 1989 eventually became an adult. Parents who buried loved ones grew old. Friends who attended funerals carried those memories into later chapters of their lives. The ripple effects continued long after public attention moved elsewhere. Then came March 2026. The news arrived quietly compared to the events that had made Alan Legere famous. No manhunt followed. No emergency alerts interrupted daily life. No fear spread through communities. The man who had once terrorized New Brunswick died in prison at the age of 78. For some observers, the announcement marked the final closing of a chapter. For others, it changed very little. The victims had been gone for decades. Their absence had already shaped countless lives. The death of the offender could not alter that reality. Still, there was symbolism in it. The story that began with violence, escape, and fear ended behind prison walls. The freedom Legere had fought so desperately to maintain never returned. The communities he terrorized endured longer than he did. The families he harmed endured longer than he did. The memories of the victims endured longer than he did. And perhaps that is the most important perspective of all. Violence often seeks power. It seeks control. It seeks to leave a mark. But time has a way of revealing what truly lasts. Not fear. Not notoriety. Not headlines. What lasts are people. What lasts are relationships. What lasts are memories shared by families and communities. Today, visitors traveling through the Miramichi region may see peaceful roads, quiet neighborhoods, rivers moving beneath open skies, and forests stretching toward the horizon. Nothing immediately reveals the fear that once existed there. Nothing announces the months when residents locked doors earlier, checked windows more often,